So tonight, this is our plan. We're just going to do a quick overview of Ci3T, specifically where Tier 2 supports fit within this context. And our big time tonight is simply focusing on Tier 2 supports. Specifically, we're going to spend some time talking about direct behavior ratings, and Mark's going to walk us through that. And then we're going to spend the second block of time talking about self-monitoring as a Tier 2 intervention, and that can be applied to like an academic behavior like work completion or improving oral reading fluency scores, coming to school on time. It could be athletic goals, it could be social skills goals, but we want you to have that flexibility. So as you come in and get started, thank you so much again. And you know, the work that we do in Ci3T, our big goal is to use the academic data along with your screening data to look for both major challenges of early childhood. And you might think about internalizing and externalizing behaviors, the ones that you're looking for. We are doing that with a goal for looking at kids at the very first sign of concern in those two broad domains, because if we have higher levels of internalizing like shy, anxious, and withdrawn, or acting out, that can contribute to challenges with students' well-being, both in how they self-regulate and how they get along with peers and adults. And even pre-pandemic, we have learned that about 20% of all school-age youth struggle with internalizing and externalizing behavior challenges. So this is not a small thing. And both the strategies that we're going to talk with you about tonight support the idea of integration. And Wendy Oakes and Mark Buckman have done these amazing things looking at like integrated lesson plannings and how to pull things together. These two strategies are going to thread the needle through those domains. So as you're thinking about the system that you're working in, remember that this isn't just coming out of Kansas or a single state. We've had the honor and the luxury of learning from literally thousands of teachers in multiple schools and districts for more than, I guess, 20 years at this point. So some of you here are also here tonight who are participating in a randomized control trial. We won't identify you, we don't embarrass you, but we thank you for the gift of your time in being in that research. And so thank you for being here tonight. So when we're thinking about what's happening at Tier 1, we want to make sure that we're clear and on the same page that we are situating these Tier 2 supports within this broader model. And a lot of times, and this is part of the reason why we actually started building the Ci3T frame in the late 90s, is a lot of people wanted to just jump to the top of the triangle. Like if I could just fix these, like, 5% of the kids in my school that are driving me crazy, everything would be fine. Or if I can just fix these kids that have Tier 2 needs. And the reality of it is, if we don't build a base where everything is taught, practiced, and reinforced, then we are not going to have an opportunity to reinforce and maintain all those great skills that are being learned at Tier 2 and at Tier 3. And Elise is nodding, so I know it must be true. So when we think about the base at your school, this is where we start. And Howard's got some great stories, as does Tammy, about why focusing on the base. So if you do have your Ci3T implementation manual open right now, now's the time to start thinking at the top about what is actually in there. And as you flip through these pages and you scroll past the mission and the purpose, you're going to get to this thing that talks about what are faculty and staff's roles and responsibility. And as you're welcoming the adults back in your building right now and resetting the vision, the why of what you're doing, the mission of your work about meeting kids' multiple needs in a way that is also healthy for teachers, keep in mind that schools, after 2 years of implementing Ci3T, pre-pandemic, those teachers reported lower burnout rates than the national average and a higher sense of efficacy, not in every domain, but in some. And we're replicating those studies as we speak right now. So we believe this is worth the investment of teacher time because it's healthy, not just for the students, but also for the adults. One of the things that you see immediately in this academic domain is that you want to empower the teachers with those low intensity supports so that they know how to elegantly and feasibly integrate those low intensity supports into Tier 1 instruction, and they too can be intensified at Tier 2. So the last time we were together at the end of 2022, we talked about just 2 of those strategies. And I've been so impressed. I was connecting with the principal just yesterday, and she was now saying that they have their instructional coach every other Thursday between now and the end of the year introducing those low intensity strategies. They're doing like 30-minute points of instruction. What a great idea. And if that's appealing to you, then on that same professional learning tab, all those resources are there like we shared last time in case that is of use to you. The other thing we want to make sure we know there's clarity for people that in addition to teaching expectations, we need to have a clear path for how we'll respond when challenging behaviors come up. This is not a punishment-based model. We believe in respectful, responsible behavior from the students and the adults. And yes, we will be setting limits for kids. Ci3T is not without consequences. They're just not punitive. And that's an important distinction. We don't want to humiliate a student. So in your plan, if you continue to scroll down, you'll see things like this flow chart that explains what is minor that's going to get handled in the classroom, what is major that's going to get handled in the office. And you'll also see definitions of what those terms look like for your building so that you can get consistent information across all your elementary schools, all your middle, all your high schools. And then whatever you've invested in terms of your social and emotional well-being curriculum, whether it's second step, connect with kids, Lion Quest, positive action, we want to make sure that people understand how to do that at tier 1. And I know one of the things that Sandy's working on right now is supporting people that are in middle and high schools so that they can see what does that actually look like? What does it look like when you're planning a master schedule? How do you get that taken care of? And I know Carla's done some great work in that area as well. So when we talk about the base and making sure that there are clarities about how those things are taught, when we talk about procedures for teaching, it's not just the behavior piece. Ci3T is the entire base. It's academics, it's behavior, it's social and emotional well-being, and making sure that you first teach the roles and responsibilities to adults so that they can then teach the students their roles and responsibilities. And then you can also take a look at, the impact for families. And we're not telling families what to do, but we do want to give them guidance on what that could look like in terms of how I can use those low intensity supports at home. And you can see some of those things that Wendy has led along with others like Katie Austin and Paloma Perez-Clark, who could not be here tonight. In addition to the teaching, we also want to make sure that the acknowledgement system is clear. It's not like you're making it rain by handing out 1 million tickets. What you are doing is you are giving kids a ticket as a recognition of meeting expectation. And the gift of having one universal reinforcer is that every adult in the building is clear on the expectation and knows that social and emotional well-being skill set so that kids can get feedback from every adult. Cafeteria workers, custodians, school psychologists. We don't want to accidentally teach our kids that you only have to respect your classroom teacher. We want them to get feedback from that wide scope of adults. And then, of course, the entire process is data informed. So that's why you're collecting things like treatment integrity to know what's happening at tier 1, which is important for tonight's discussion. Because if you look at your data, when you compile your data from your reading and your math and your internalizing and your externalizing, or if you're using another screening tool, you want to look to see, do I have close to 80%, like 75% to 80% of the kids responding to tier 1? Because if not, we need to focus on the base. We need to focus on tier 1. But these pieces weave together, and we're not asking teachers to do one more thing. We are not asking them to write these, scripted long lesson plans, but conceptually. So I think it's about transferring this information to other places in San Diego. We want her to be able to know to say, we're not asking you to write all this out, but conceptually think about when you're in front of kids, when you tell them this is what we're going to accomplish academically, you're also going to pre-correct them to say, this is an awesome time for us to really practice our empathy or problem solving or cooperation. And you are going to tell them that, like, hey, do you remember that whole lesson we did on showing empathy to other kids? When we do this lesson today on Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, I would like you to really listen for characters that really did a great job with that and others who kind of fell short. And you might even have one of the assignments be writing a letter to a character in a novel to say, here's a different way you could have handled that could have had a better outcome. And how you see these low intensity supports, the idea would be keep these in the forefront of your planning and then use them like during your anticipatory set, during guided practice, independent practice, etc. So when we think about that whole idea of integration at tier 1, we want to make sure that teachers have a voice. I don't think there's ever been a more complicated time in history to be a teacher than what we have all lived through in the last several years. And so I love and applaud the fact that in your districts and in your schools, you administer the primary intervention rating scale, the PERS, 2 times a year, every fall, every spring, come hell or high water, so that the adults get to give an opportunity to say, here's what I think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. So you can look at these data along with implementation data. And that's kind of like data that allows you to be the Nancy Drew of professional learning, because from those social validity data about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes, you can figure out where the pain points are, either clarifying misunderstandings. If you get a lot of comments about like, oh, this looks like bribery rather than reinforcement. So when we think about accurately detecting kids that need more in terms of the tier 2 interventions that we're going to talk about tonight, we need to know these things about tier 1 first. We need to know what the adults think. We need to know what's happening in terms of procedures for teaching, procedures for reinforcing, and we need to make sure that we have the data so that you can accurately detect who needs more than tier 1 has to offer. And I just want to say deeply and respectfully, tier 2 is not a tragedy. It doesn't mean there's bad instruction. It doesn't mean it's a bad teacher. It doesn't mean it's a bad kid. It's absolutely an expectation. There's going to be opportunities where kids need more than everything has to offer. When I was in elementary school, I had really amazing teachers. And I remember one teacher taught us how to use a protractor. And if you know what a protractor is, raise your hand on your screen. And if you don't, okay, it's like a ruler with a hump. Okay. So I remember her passing that and teaching us how to do it. And so like there's an angle and there's a little circle on the protractor and you had to put the circle on the angle. And I swear to you, day 3 of instruction, she passes it out and I cannot for the life of me remember like, what do you do with this? And she comes to me and she like takes that out of my hand. I'm like, can you show me this one more time? I'm so sorry. I just don't remember how to do it. And she takes that out of my hand. She knocks me on the head with it. And she's like, do you have anything going on up there? And I'm like, no, nothing at all. So if you could just show me just one more time. And I am not suggesting that tier 2 is like using the instructional tools as a weapon, but the point would be, I needed one more trial. I needed a little more instruction. It's not that I needed a small group. I didn't need to go 5 days a week or 2 days a week someplace else. I needed more. It didn't mean I was a bad kid. I just didn't get it. Does that make sense? So when we think about tier 2 in a Ci3T frame, if you have an implementation manual right now, will you scroll all the way down to find your tier 2 and tier 3? And if you don't, we have exemplars on our website. And so maybe Katie, Austin, and Wendy can give us some insight on where to find those. But in our Ci3T system, there are plans, explicit plans as to what to do with kids that need tier 2 or tier 3 supports. And we want to create clarity as to who might need those extra supports after we've made sure tier 1's in place, teachers are using those low intensity supports. And then I want to use these screening data to accurately detect who needs more. So if I'm in situations like these last 2 years worth of data, that's a manageable percentage of kids to support with tier 2. At the start of their first year of implementation, this would not have been reasonable to start by putting 27% of the kids into tier 2. So we want to make good use of your resources, good use of your time, and making sure that we're doing this data informed approach. The other thing I want to say in a Ci3T model, it's not, and we want to dispel the myth. Back in the day, people used to think tier 2 was a small group. You left the classroom, there was an expert, they went and did these things. In a Ci3T model, that may be true. You may go do some things like social skills group or anger management groups, but a lot of times it's just increasing the intensity. But the idea would be, we want to create these positive, productive, comfortable learning environments where you don't have to be perfect. I am 56 years old. My CrossFit workout this morning, people were moving a lot more weight than I was. 2 days ago, everybody's jumping on boxes and I was stepping. I still don't feel excluded. I don't feel embarrassed. I'm suiting up, I'm showing up, I'm having a good time, and I love being everybody's gym mom. I say all this to you because as you are building your tiered library for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 practices in these low intensity supports, tonight we're talking about tier 2. But I don't want you to be worried about feeling like you need 1 million more people to do tier 2. We are looking for efficient, effective practices that can be done in these inclusive environments. And we want to introduce to you to things that have enough evidence that to suggest that if you do these as planned, you're going to get this change in student behavior, either more engagement, more work completion, more joy in terms of more positive social interactions with peers. And in your grid, if you have an intervention grid, and Katie has put a link as to where to find some, have you found your tier 2 grids? So if you think about this, when you look at your grids, you got a whole listing of things that you plan to do, and some will be small groups, some are just going to be bumping up the intensity. But there's a short description of what that intervention is, and we're going to talk about this one tonight. And here's the game changer. In a CI3T model, rather than it being a teacher who has to look around and say, anyone needed, or a counselor, anyone, or a parent calling in, you're going to actually use the data 3 times a year to accurately detect who might need more. So when you look at your intervention grids, if you have a self-monitoring grid, you tonight can be thinking about, all right, in my building or in my school or in my district, for whom might this be a good idea? Because we want to make sure, as we support our equity work, we want to make sure that we are accurately looking for kids at the first sign of concern, and we don't want to overlook a kid that might benefit from this extra intervention. You're not saying you have to do it, but we want to look at the screening data. And then anytime we do a tier 2 intervention, like when Mark starts talking very shortly, and you're going to learn about those DBRs, you're going to want to make sure, do I know that tier 1's in place? Do I know if this kid feels comfortable with it? Like with a self-monitoring intervention, if your idea that there's going to be something on the kid's desk and you explain this intervention, if they say to Mindy, I would feel so embarrassed if this was on my desk, then don't do it. Like, find something else. We'll do something that's more private, or we might put that monitoring sheet in a more private place. So we want things that have high social validity. We also want to keep track of, is it happening? I know Theresa's run small groups for years and organized professional learning on that. And the reality of it is, just because we say a kid got assigned to a tier 2 reading intervention or a math intervention or a writing intervention or check in, check out, doesn't mean it's necessarily happening. So somebody like Jessica, she wants to make sure that she has the data to know, maybe the kids screened in, but were they in attendance? Did they participate? And then did you see changes in student performance? And we absolutely have to have a plan to know, is it working? And sometimes it's working well, and so we might fade the intervention. Other times it may not be working enough, and we might bump up to a different, more intensive tier 2 or a tier 3. There might be times we just go directly to tier 3. But as you're looking at the work that you're doing right now, you can conceptualize this part. So think about this entry criteria. And if you are lucky enough to work in a system where you have a system that pulls in multiple sources of data together, you can do basically data-informed decision-making, where you're going to look to see, like, show me all the kids in my class that have moderate to high levels of, externalizing behavior patterns, or kids that are having tier 2 or tier 3 needs in terms of Ames Web or reading. And so you can essentially, for those of you who do Excel, and I want to give a shout out to Mark Buckman, he designed this little slide, and I think it's so good, but basically it's just showing how to sort. So looking for the kids that are at moderate risk in both those areas, so that so sometimes people are worried about, like, does that mean I have to do one intervention for academics and another one for behavior? This is an example of an intervention that can be integrated. So when we're thinking about how to find those kids, we also want to encourage you to look at attendance data. It is not shocking that kids get behind if they're not in attendance. And there's some very good studies done by Hill Walker out of University of Oregon. He made this wonderful tool called the School Archival Record Search. And they learned that if a kid misses more than 10 days for any reason, like for illness, truancy, they're at heightened risk for school failure. And so we need to pay attention to that, especially in the COVID era. If kids are missing a large amount of school, we need to make sure that we are empowering them with some other types of supports that are not stressful, but are practical and things that are effective. And so as you look through your intervention grids, we want to make sure we're doing things that work. We don't have the luxury of doing things without sufficient evidence. So when you look at your intervention grids that you have listed right here in your manual, and you look at these on your screen, what we have tried to make for you are on-demand, free access professional learning resources. You are welcome to use any of these. The work that we do is theoretically ground in applied behavior analysis. And as we're working through these 2 tier 2 supports tonight, and for those of you that are here for BCBA, we appreciate your time. And you'll notice when you look at the task list that these are well aligned with those practices. We're going to focus on 2, but there are certainly more than 2. So at this moment, I am going to pause, and I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mark.
Thank you, Kathleen. If everyone will just give me 1 second to get my screen set up. There we go. All right. Can you see my presentation slide and not my presenter slide? Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you guys about direct behavior rating. It's a really cool tier 2 intervention. And yes, I did just describe it as cool. And I actually believe that. It's cool because I like Kathleen's illustration of the CrossFit example, as sort of an emphasis that tier 2 doesn't have to be some separate interventionist that you're sending kids to, or a small group that you're pulling kids out of core. And it doesn't have to be that way. It can be very simple things that we plug into the classroom that are subtle changes in the environment. So direct behavior rating is exactly that. It's something that teachers can do without needing any additional support. They just need a little bit of training. I also really think DBR, which is what I'll call direct behavior rating throughout this little part of the presentation, DBR has incredible resources online, both through ci3t.org and through a site that we'll connect you with that's published from UConn, University of Connecticut, that gives basically all the teacher training that people would need to get up and running with DBR, really without relying on anybody else to give them extra support to learn how to use this. So it's very simple. It can be done in the classroom. And the last piece that I want to emphasize is that a constant question that people have when they're working in Ci3T or other tiered systems is like, how do we do progress monitoring for behavior? People understand that you can do, oral reading probes for reading or math curriculum-based measures to progress monitor math progress. But how do you do progress monitoring for behavior? And DBR provides exactly that, a super easy to use, valid and reliable measure that you can actually do daily assessment of behavior. So if you have kids that have tier 2 intervention plans or general education intervention plans, and you're trying to figure out how do we monitor progress, this is an incredible resource that's both an assessment tool and an intervention. So I hope I piqued your interest a little bit with that little preamble. And then let me just connect you to where you can find some of the resources that I'll be sharing with you tonight on the ci3t.org website. So if you visit ci3t.org and choose the professional learning tab at the top of the website, you'll be able to scroll down and find these blue accordions. And if you were to click on the one that says direct behavior rating or DBR, it's going to open up. And what you'll find is a whole collection of resources, and you'll see a screenshot of what resources are available here, one of which is a PowerPoint presentation. And the slides that are included that I'll be going through over the next couple of minutes are actually lifted directly from this presentation. And I want to emphasize that basically that what we're going to present to you tonight is something that you could take and present to your colleagues that you work with in your district or your school, and basically walk through to give them training on direct behavior rating. So if this seems like a useful intervention or assessment tool that could be really helpful to you all in the work that you're doing, you have the resources to kind of train people by taking what you're learning here tonight and sharing it back with folks as well. We also have data collection forms, which we'll review as part of this PowerPoint presentation, all of which can be downloaded and accessed right there through that DBR accordion. So let's jump into talking about what exactly this is. And again, these slides that you're seeing are taken directly from that PowerPoint from the website. We're going to talk about what DBR is, why it's effective, what the research says about this assessment tool and strategy, some of the benefits and potential challenges that you might run into if you were trying to implement DBR. And then we'll go through a step-by-step process that shows exactly how to get this up and running in your classroom, as well as some tools that you can use to assess how well it's working and how well people feel, or how people feel about the DBR procedures, because we want to make sure that people feel comfortable with what's being asked of them in terms of how this changes the school environment for the students, and then what the workload would be like for teachers who are trying to implement this intervention. So DBR is going to fit into our Ci3T model or any multi-tiered system of support, primarily as a tier 2 intervention. The reason that it's going to be tier 2 is that it's not the most rigorous in terms of intervention procedures. It's fairly feasible to do, but that means it's probably not going to be intensive enough to support kids with the most intense intervention needs. And it's going to be too much for kids that don't really need that much extra support. So we want to find kids that really have that moderate risk level, probably for behavior, that we're going to provide this intervention to. Now, that said, Kathleen mentioned before that when we're thinking about an integrated tiered system like Ci3T, we want to think about how we can support students' academic, behavioral, and social and emotional well-being needs at the same time. And so as I'm talking about the procedures to get DBR in place, you might actually realize how this tool might be helpful for increasing academic performance by increasing academic engagement. So even though we're thinking about this as a behavioral intervention, you might actually kind of earmark this as something that might be useful for kids that struggle in reading or struggle in math because they're not disruptive, but maybe they're not fully engaged during instruction. And maybe you're looking for some way to help those kids really lean into instruction and get the most out of it. And so this actual intervention might be super helpful for kids like that. And so you might think of it not just in terms of behavior, but also academics as well. So DBR is going to be a brief rating that's going to be used during a specific period of class. So for example, you might use DBR for whole group reading instruction or whole group math instruction or small group intervention time. And you're going to choose that time period based on student needs. So when does a challenging behavior occur? Or when does the student need a little bit of extra support engaging in instruction? The answer to that question is going to inform when the DBR is going to be used. And you would use the DBR during that same time every single day. The DBR is going to involve the teacher checking in with the student before and after that time period to remind them of the expectations. So that is basically a pre-correction, to provide feedback and behavior-specific praise, particularly after the period is over, to say, hey, this went really well, and this is what you could do to improve in terms of your behavior next time. And students may also receive some reinforcement at the end of that period as well. But the really important thing is during that period of time, the teacher is going to be observing the student and rating their behavior. And I'll talk about what behaviors might be rated and how they're going to be rated in just a moment. But they're going to be observing that student and rating their behavior as it occurs during that time period. I want to emphasize that this rating is, we can think about it as a pretty good estimate of a certain behavior, how often that behavior occurs during a certain period of time, but it doesn't require the teacher to watch that student the entire time and monitor their behavior throughout an entire, 60-minute reading block, for example. The teacher is able to go about their normal instructional practice, but they're going to be keeping an eye on that student throughout the time, just like they probably would be anyways, to monitor their behavior. And then as soon as that time period is over, they're going to rate the occurrence of that behavior that they're going to be watching for during that period. DBR is going to give teachers potentially a tool to share student successes and challenges with parents as they relate to what's happening at school in terms of behavior. I'm going to return to this idea a little bit later, but basically you can actually think of DBR as sort of like one of the oldest interventions that has existed in schools, because it's very similar to the traditional like homeschool progress note that people have been using literally for decades. However, we're going to use some pretty specific procedures as part of the DBR that although it's similar to those homeschool notes, it's not quite the same. And I'll show some examples of why using the specific practices that we'll talk about tonight are going to be important to keep this a positive tool to make sure we're building relationships with families and really building students up in terms of sharing positives and maybe areas for growth, instead of using those progress notes for just documentation of things that the student didn't do right at school, which sometimes they can kind of go that route if we're not careful. You also notice that the DBR maybe sounds similar to check-in, check-out, if you're familiar with that intervention, because we're talking about this sort of daily progress note. It is similar to check-in, check-out, but the real nice thing about DBR is it doesn't require you to have like a mentor that the student is checking in and checking out with every day. The DBR is going to be taking place entirely in the classroom, and the teacher can be the one that's guiding implementation throughout. So it's a little bit easier to do because you're not reliant on having like a check-in, check-out systems coordinator and mentors and all this infrastructure set up. This is something that a teacher can do in their own classroom without a whole bunch of extra support that's happening outside of the context of that classroom. And then lastly, there may be a self-monitoring component that could be used as part of DBR. I'm not going to get too deep into that right now because Kathleen in a little bit is going to talk about self-monitoring as a standalone intervention. But as we're talking about ratings of student behavior, you might return to this idea and think about how students might actually be able to rate their own behavior and use that rating as a process by which they'll think about their own behavior and potentially use that to learn how to manage their own thoughts and feelings and actions to maybe help them be more successful at school as well. Okay, so I promised I would talk. What do I mean when I say rate behavior? So I have three different potential rating systems on the screen right now, and I'll talk through each of them. And I'm going to tell you that one of these is probably better than the rest of them. So starting at the top, we have a 5-point scale that ranges from 1 to 5. And it says, about how often did Tony show disruptive behavior during reading rotations? That's a pretty good behavior to rate. You could rate disruptive behavior. And you can see that it has a star on the left side of the rating scale to show a low a low rating would be good, right? You would want to have a student that's less disruptive as opposed to more disruptive. This is a pretty good way to assess a behavior without requiring a formal direct systematic observation. The one thing that might be a bit hard here is that having only 5 points to rate the behavior means that if you were to look at your data over time, it's a little bit harder to show improvement because you can't have as much variability on a 5-point scale. So hold that in your mind for just a second. There's another rating scale here that has happy faces. It says circle the face that best describes Paul's respectful behavior during math. Respectful behavior is a great behavior to assess. However, you only have 3 response options here to assess the behavior. And they kind of have a little bit of baggage associated with them because you have the sad face, the happy face. And when talking to a student, sometimes the sad face can kind of become a bit of a trigger because we're implying, you made me sad or you did a sad job or something like that. So not ideal. It's okay. Particularly for younger students, you might need to have some visuals that accompany the rating just to help them understand what you're talking about. But particularly having only 3 response options really limits the ability for you to show improvement if you're trying to use this as an assessment system. So in that way, it's not quite ideal. What is cool about this one, though, is that it has these little notes below it that says, today I forgot to, and today I remembered to. If you were looking to use something like DBR to communicate with parents about what went really well and something that you'd like the child to work on, and they like to have conversations with their adults at home, this is a great way to frame that feedback in a very constructive way. So we'll come back to that idea in a little bit. At the bottom, we have this green rating scale that goes from 0 to 10. It says circle the number that best reflects Xavier's academically engaged behavior during reading time. And academic engagement is a great behavior to assess using DBR. And what's really great about this 11-point scale is that a rating scale that has 11 different response options really gives a lot of flexibility in terms of showing progress because you can have a lot of variability in performance over time. And by having more response options, it basically makes it easier. If you were to imagine a graph, you could see how having more response options would actually make it easier to show improvement over time because you have less restriction in terms of the data that you might be collecting. And what's really great about this is it kind of has all the critical features of a DBR, which I'll highlight for you here. If I can get my laser pointer to work. At the bottom, it's got these nice little anchors that say 0% never. So basically, Xavier was never academically engaged would be a 0. It's got sometimes over the 5. So it's like about 50% of the time you would circle a 5. And if he was always engaged, you would circle a 10, which is up here on the right side of the scale. Having those little qualitative anchors is super helpful for you as the rater because it sort of helps you parse out like what does a 5 mean or what does a 10 mean? And as you're trying to rate their behavior, you can kind of start with the far ends or the middle of the rating scale and say, if he wasn't engaged all the time, I'd start, sort of in the middle and say, was he engaged more than half of the time? Yeah, he was engaged more than half of the time. And you can kind of work your way up the scale to decide what the most appropriate rating of his behavior would be. So as you're thinking about what this might look like in practice, these 11-point scales are really sort of the ideal setup for a DBR because they do give you sort of the best ability to show improvement over time. So then moving along, talking about the uses and applications of DBR, really the great thing about this tool is that it provides both an intervention and an assessment tool. So let's talk about what it looks like as an assessment tool. Basically, what it lets you do is you can identify and define a really specific behavior of concern and or behaviors to increase. So if you've got a kiddo that has a really specific behavior challenge, you could use DBR to assess the occurrence of that specific behavior in the context where it's causing that student difficulty. That is an option. Or if you have a student that just sort of has general behavior problems, the research team that's done a lot of work on DBR has found that there are 3 behaviors that you can look at in terms of assessment that are really predictive of positive school outcomes. And the DBR really shines for doing a good job assessing those behaviors. Those behaviors are academic engagement, respectful behavior, and disruptive behavior. Of course, you're looking for higher levels of academic engagement, higher levels of respectful behavior, and lower levels of disruptive behavior. And if you can work with students on those behaviors and assess their progress over time, you can find that kids actually are a lot more successful by sort of maximizing their engagement and reducing their disruptive behavior. In addition to the fact that it gives a lot of flexibility in terms of what behaviors you might assess. It lets you define exactly when you're going to collect data. You can choose the exact period of time during the school day where that student is struggling, and you would use the DBR during that precise time. And the data are easily graphed. And like, if you're a visual person, graphs are wonderful because they really help you interpret the data. But even if not, if you're looking at, sheets after sheet after sheet of like point sheets, it's kind of hard to know whether you've got students that are making progress until you put that information on a graph. And if you're collecting data in a way that's not easily graphed, it really takes away from you the option to look at what you're doing and make adjustments as necessary. If you're not seeing progress because the line is flat, you can say, okay, what can we do differently? Without the graph, it's really hard to make those decisions. And so the fact that DBR is really amenable to being graphed is a huge, huge benefit. So as an assessment tool, it has lots of advantages. Now, as a communication tool, this becomes pretty interesting. And I'll talk later about the research on DBR, but I'll give you a spoiler alert, which is that it tends to work the best when there is a component of home and school communication. The DBR is sent home to parents on a daily basis as a method for communicating progress at school, with an emphasis on always sharing at least something positive that the student has done, so that parents or guardians or whomever students are interacting with at home always can have a positive conversation about something that went well, and noting anything that might need to be practiced or discussed at home as well. So we're really balancing what that communication looks like. And it also is going to help encourage some shared responsibility for student success. So something that can become a problem for teachers oftentimes is when students are really struggling at school, there's sort of this communication about like, you're trying to express to parents what's not going so well at school, but it sort of ends up communicating like, I need you, the parent, to change the child's behavior so that they're better at school. The DBR is actually going to kind of turn that on its head and say, hey, we're doing this support for the child at school. This is what we're trying. This is how it's going. We want to keep you in the loop about this. And we want you to have conversations so that when we're talking about things at school, about things that are going well or things that we could do better on, you guys can echo those same conversations at home as well. So we're really emphasizing that shared responsibility and collaboration and communication from home to school, which is going to build those partnerships, build trust, build relationships. And that's going to be part of what we're doing to support these students in a holistic fashion. And lastly, of course, really emphasizing the positive things that are happening at school. So making sure that those progress notes, if they're going home, are always emphasizing at least something good that the child did that's pro-social, helping them learn at school, helping them be successful at school. Okay, and then the last piece is an intervention. So I think I really emphasize that this is a tool that can be used for assessment, but how does this actually help to change behavior? What it's going to do is it's going to provide teachers with a really clear and consistent framework for talking to students about behavior. So I mentioned you check in with the kid before the observation period and after the observation period. That's a perfect reminder to always be pre-correcting for the expected behaviors, providing feedback and behavior-specific praise on what went well and what needs to be worked on. So having that systematic conversation that's happening with students in a really formulaic and consistent manner is going to be super helpful for helping that student be set up for success, because they know what's expected as you're having that conversation with them on a consistent basis. It also potentially is going to add in this aspect of self-monitoring. So we're encouraging students to think about their own behavior because they know that the teacher is monitoring their behavior. Not as like not a surveillance, and not, hopefully not like watching you like a hawk kind of thing, but rather as a supportive mechanism to say, hey, like I'm keeping an eye on you so that I can help you be successful. I want you to think about your behavior as well, so that when you're engaging in reading instruction or when you're thinking about math, we're working together to kind of help you get the most out of that instructional time. So why is this effective? It's effective for a couple of different reasons over those 3 different uses. It's an efficient way to monitor change in behavior over time. And this is a huge, huge gift to you, especially if you're working in a capacity where you're helping teachers to make intervention plans or to monitor general education interventions, because we need effective, reliable, and valid methods to assess behavioral change. And the DBR is a great way to do that because it's not requiring a huge amount of teacher time or training or external people coming in to do observations. It's something you can build into the classroom environment. It's also going to provide that potential tool to facilitate efficient, clear, and kind homeschool communication. And it's going to provide those structured opportunities to do pre-correction, give feedback, and provide praise, all of which are great and effective practices for students. And the DBR is going to give us that reminder to make sure that we're using those strategies on a consistent basis. So in terms of the research for direct behavior rating, the research suggests that it's an effective intervention tool to increase academic engagement and reduce disruptive behavior. And those are no-brainer targets. Like, we know that if we can increase engagement, we're probably going to help kids be more successful in their academics. And if we can reduce disruption, we're making our classrooms more kind and joyful places for kids to learn. DBR has also been used for kids across the grade span, and has been shown to be effective both for elementary and secondary students. And it's also been used as an intervention for kids with disabilities, specifically with ADHD, as an effective tool for increasing academic engagement. And then the last bullet here is part of a meta-analysis that a woman named Kimber Van Est, who's a rock star in our field, she published this to kind of look at what are some of the trends in these direct behavior ratings. In this particular meta-analysis, they were calling it, I think, daily report cards. So kind of this way to assess behavior at school and communicate home. They found that those tools are most effective when there is that homeschool communication piece. So if that can be inserted into these interventions, it's going to help it be most effective. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. All of that said, I do think it's worth kind of pausing here for just a moment and thinking about what that homeschool communication is going to look like. We always want to be mindful that conversations at home between parents and children or guardians and children don't always look the way they look at school in terms of being constructive and positive. And so if you know that you have parents that have adults at home who maybe aren't always the most constructive in the way they interact with students, or where students might be anxious or scared about what that note says because they're not sure how it's going to be responded to by their parent. In those cases, you might actually hold on to those progress reports, and instead of sending them home, or at least without having so much corrective feedback, we want to kind of be mindful about making sure that we're not putting the student in an awkward position in terms of what those conversations will look like at home. So definitely something to keep in mind. But if you can find a way to include that homeschool communication, that truly is the most effective way to set up these interventions. So you've now kind of heard a little bit about what this looks like. I want to emphasize that there are some incredible resources at your disposal to learn more about direct behavior rating or to pass on to your colleagues at school. There is a resource guide document, which is available on ci3t.org. The very first link on this document is basically a training module on DBR provided by the University of Connecticut. It's a phenomenal resource that has a lot of videos that you can actually go through a training process that will give you a certificate when you're done. What it will let you do is you can watch videos of classrooms and provide ratings on the academic engagement, disruptive, and respectful behavior of students in those videos. And you can compare your ratings against the ratings provided in the module. And it kind of lets you practice using this tool in a way that you can feel comfortable and confident in using it before you go to your classroom to use it. Now, as we think about some benefits and challenges, the huge benefits, I think I've mentioned most of these. It requires fewer resources than other interventions like check-in, check-out. It's super, super flexible, so we can use it to assess different types of behaviors and in different settings. The availability of online resources makes it much, much easier for you to scale this up at your school. So if you're thinking about getting a systematic direct behavior rating process in place in your school to help monitor the behavior of students with tier 2 needs, this is a great option because you can use it in a consistent fashion throughout your school, thanks to those resources. It's got potential to improve a variety of important classroom behaviors, including academic engagement and respectful behavior, and decreasing disruptive behavior. And it provides that structure for increasing positive teacher and student interactions and attention. Now, there are just a few things that we want to kind of emphasize that might need to be addressed in terms of challenges. We want to make sure that we're taking very careful consideration to maintain positive communications with students when providing corrective feedback. The direct behavior rating conversations that happen before and after the observation block can start to feel very punishing to students if they're always receiving negative feedback, or if they're super competitive with themselves or with other kids. They might get really preoccupied with the number that we're rating on that DBR scale or any of the feedback that's being provided. There's no easy answer to this. It's definitely something that you have to keep in mind, but you want to be mindful of individual student preferences, dispositions, and interests when thinking about how to structure this. And if you're worried that students might become disincentivized or frustrated with that negative feedback, if they're always getting corrective feedback, think about how we phrase that information, because there's always a way to give corrective feedback in a way that doesn't feel quite so biting or hard to take. We just have to find the right way to communicate with individual students based on their dispositions. So that individualization is definitely necessary to make this work best in your classroom. We also want to make sure we're taking very careful consideration to how to keep positive communication with parents. I mentioned this before, but if we're concerned that the conversations at home might be a little bit punitive or not quite as constructive as we hope for, we want to keep that in mind when setting up any potential communication aspect of the DBR. And then lastly, we want to think about the needs of students who are motivated by escaping tasks rather than accessing teacher attention. One of the great things about DBR is you're basically guaranteeing students will get attention before the observation and after the observation, because you're having those conversations with students. In terms of behavior analysis, you could think of this as like non-contingent reinforcement, because the kids are getting access to attention. However, for kiddos that are really more maintained by escape, you do want to keep that in mind, that you're not necessarily building in as much of a reinforcement component into the intervention, because attention isn't the maintaining consequence. So you might think about how you could use, for example, your universal reinforcement system in the form of tickets for getting good ratings on the DBR that could be exchanged for opportunities to escape from non-preferred tasks, for example. Okay, so let's talk about a step-by-step process for how this could actually be implemented in your classroom. So we have a couple of steps that we'll walk through here before we talk about some data collection tools that are available. So the first step is going to be to identify students who might benefit from using the DBR. To accomplish this, Kathleen was showing the Tier 2 intervention grids earlier. You would want to look in your school's Ci3T implementation manual to find DBR as an available Tier 2 intervention, and check out the entry criteria. And then you're looking at your class or your school-wide data to find students who meet those criteria. Oftentimes, this is going to be kids that have moderate risk for externalizing behaviors, maybe moderate risk for internalizing behaviors, or maybe those challenges in combination with some academic challenges as well. The next step is going to be to define 1 to 3 behaviors to target that are going to be most impactful for that student. You might choose really specific behaviors that might be causing difficulties for that student, or you might lean into those 3 behaviors we mentioned before, which DBR is great at assessing and intervening to support, which are academic engagement, respectful behavior, and disruptive behavior. The third step is going to be to determine exactly what period of time the observation should take place during. You would want to prioritize a time that's going to be consistent every day. So hopefully you have a class schedule that allows events more or less to take the same amount of time and happen in the same order every day. And you want to choose a time that's actually when the student is having difficulty. So that behavior that you're going to measure and choose in step 2 might be something that the student is struggling to accomplish during this specific time of day. Once you've picked the observation period and the behaviors to assess, you would want to make a DBR form. We have a really good DBR form that you can download on ci3t.org that you could actually just use exactly as is if you're assessing academic engagement, respectful, and disruptive behavior. If you want to customize it, you're certainly welcome to do that as well. But you do want to make sure that you're using best practices in assembling those DBR scales, such as using a 0 to 10 scale and using some anchor text like not at all, half the time, all of the time to help in the rating process. The final 4 steps are going to be at step 5, seeking input on that DBR form before we actually start to use it. It's a really good idea to show students that form and get their input on the behaviors that you're working on, what it looks like, to make sure that A, they're familiar with the procedures, and B, that they have a chance to have input as well. You don't want to do anything that's going to be embarrassing for the student or feel overly critical. And so by having them give input early in this process and actually making revisions based on their feedback, you're really helping them become an active participant in this intervention process, which is going to set you up for success. As the teacher, you might also reflect on your own social validity in terms of, do you feel like this is going to work? Do you feel like this is feasible? For example, if you're trying to do this with 5 kids during the same instructional block, I can tell you from experience that's probably not going to work very well, because you'll have too much paper. You got a bunch of clipboards, you just don't have the capacity to do that much at the same time. So definitely kind of taking your own consideration under advisement there as well. The next thing you're going to do is practice rating using the online DBR website, which is the Yukon site that I mentioned before. It's that great training module with videos and resources to support your use of DBR. You can find that link on the Ci3T website. When we do the breakout session here in just a minute, we'll help you find that information as well. And then up next, you're going to teach the student the DBR procedures. This is going to be making sure that they understand that you're going to have a short little conference with them before and after that observation period, telling them exactly what that conversation is going to look like and what's going to happen in terms of, is that going to go home to parents or what that all will look like. And then lastly, you're going to implement the DBR procedures, which are going to be daily steps that you can use to make sure that you're using the DBR as planned. And now I might have told you a little fib. I thought we were done. There's 2 more steps. The last 2 steps are going to be to do ongoing data reviews, preferably weekly, and then to seek input from students and families after about 2 to 3 weeks. The purpose is to make sure that as the actual intervention is up and running, that you're getting some input from people to iron out any bumps that might be taking place and making sure that it's actually feeling like a support for everyone involved. So then moving on, as you're beginning to implement DBR, you're going to want to have some way to assess treatment integrity, social validity, and how well the intervention is working. So treatment integrity is going to be basically, are we putting the procedures into place as planned on a daily basis? I went backwards, but I went to go forwards. There is a treatment integrity checklist that's actually built into the DBR form that you can use to assess whether the daily procedures are being implemented as planned. I'm not going to go over these 5 or these 6 steps in detail right now because those are available to you on the website materials, but they're nice reminders just to make sure that the daily steps are filled, are followed every day. And you've got social validity forms that are available on the website as well. These are nice structured ways that you can have a conversation with students and families about whether they feel like this intervention is going to be effective at supporting what's important to them in terms of the behavior of students at school. We also have forms that can be filled out by teachers as well, so that they can reflect on whether they think this will be an effective intervention to use in their classroom. And what's most exciting is we also have a data tracker that can be downloaded, where as you're collecting these data, you can input your information from the DBR form. It's going to go into this Excel spreadsheet and will graph more or less automatically for you, which is really nice so that you don't have to set up your own data tools. They're kind of all set for you. So as you're collecting the DBR data, having those graphs available is one of the great benefits. And so having that tool ready to go is super, super nice. And it even will graph for you and show you your treatment integrity over time as well. So if you're trying to keep track, not just of the student outcomes, but how well the intervention is being implemented, all of that information is summarized for you in nice, neat little tables that'll help point out, if you have anything that you need to tighten up in terms of the DBR usage in your classroom, that information is there as well. And if this is all sounding interesting and compelling to you, we actually have intervention grids that you can download that you could use to insert into your school Ci3T implementation manual, potentially during the course of the summer when you're revising your manual. If you're working with your Ci3T leadership team to do that, these grids can be taken directly from the website and placed right in there, which is super nice so that you don't have to make this from scratch. You can just take that in there, and this is going to give you a starting point for teachers to use this intervention at your school at the elementary and secondary level.
The bank of what you would have and you could use is right here. So we're going to share this information in a slightly different way than we did before. So what we're going to ask you to do right now is on your own, if you could on your own log into this website and give me a thumbs up if you're there now, if you're seeing these blue bars. Okay, great. So when you click on that self-monitoring site, and I'm going to show you what it looks like for me on my screen. So now I'm bringing you to my web browser. When you click on it, you're going to see something that probably looks pretty similar to the DBRs. You're going to see this little definition, and then you're going to see all the supporting documents. And if you click this one, it's going to download all documents in one fell swoop. And just like Mark walked through DBRs with you, this is what that self-monitoring PowerPoint would look like. So it walks through all of the steps on exactly what it is, how to do it, and the supporting evidence about here's the why you should consider doing it. And it gives you an even-handed discussion of here's the challenges of doing it. So be aware of these things, and here's the strengths of doing it. So I want to show you this. You can literally click right here, which we're going to do right now. And I'm ready to go now. I'm ready to tell you about self-monitoring. And you're going to see this predictable list of questions. And you could say, all of you have this in your grid. We're working at tier 2 today. We're going to spend this little bit of time. And some schools will do it like in Ignite sessions where it's 10 minutes. Some will do like what Mark just modeled for you, where it's about 30 minutes to explain it. Some schools will do breakouts and they're actually going to have you build it. If we were in person together and I was part of your school, this is what I would do. I would have everybody locate this very last item on that website. And let me show you where this is in case you do want to do it. It says designing a self-monitoring plan. There's a PDF version and there's a Word version. So click on the Word version, please. And when you do, you're going to bring this up. So if I was at your district and I was there to do professional learning, ahead of time, I would have said, we're working in your Ci3T implementation plan. Tonight, we're working at tier 2. And in the past, when Wendy and David and Eric and I did this years ago, when they were doc students, when David and Eric were doc students, we would be in person with large number of people in a room. We would communicate with them the way we do with you. And so 1 week before, we would remind them, we're coming together, we're going to do self-monitoring. And we would say, please come with one student in mind. So somebody that on your intervention grid in your Ci3T plan is showing in as screening in according to your tier 2 grid. So if you're thinking, I don't remember what a tier 2 grid is, you can click on that item as well in that bank of materials. And it's going to have that same thing that Howard just talked about, where it has the name of the support, the description of what that support is. And I'm going to open one for you. And this is editable, not editable, but editable, so that you can edit this based on your school's entry criteria. So like if you used like the SABRS, or if you use the SSBD instead of the student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing, you could go in and edit this. And you might decide in your school, we are only going to do this for kids that are at moderate risk. So in your school-wide plan, you may take out this part. So I just want to show you, I literally just downloaded that from the website and I can edit it just that simply. And whatever's your school decides on, that's what you're going to do. So I might bring the name of a student. So if Wendy Oakes was the teacher, I for sure would screen in on this. So she might bring the name Kathleen Lane. And I might be scoring in the moderate risk for externalizing and internalizing, and I might have some of these other challenges. Then I would tell people, please pull up this planning sheet. And if you scroll through this, do you remember those steps that Mark just went through? It was like a total of, I think, multiple steps that were checklisted through. This is what's right here. So now keep that in mind and open it off to the side. Have that mentor. It's a large group of people. Teachers can do DBRs. Teacher can also do the self-monitoring. And in your grid, you might have the exact same entry criteria that all lead to those same 3 interventions. So then if you were meeting with a family or a student, you could say, we have 3 options. So it's showing that you've kind of got moderate challenges with, work completion, and we've got some, little more than average acting out issues. And so I've got 3 choices. And you could explain these 3 interventions to the family with the kid, and they'll pick out the one that feels most comfortable. Self-monitoring is cool for a number of reasons, which I want to show you just briefly. Again, it is a tier 2 support. And ideally, you want to make sure that tier 1's in place. And when we go through this, there's 3 things. Anytime we do something extra for a kid, we're going to want to know, is it happening? What do people think about it before you start and after it's underway? And is it working? And I really, really cannot emphasize enough, the is it happening piece is huge. How many of you have a gym membership? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have already gone to the gym the number of times you plan to with your New Year's resolution? We have the best laid plans. We have these ideas for tier 2, and then life happens. And we hear this a lot from, especially those that are trying new interventions. It's like, it's so much harder than I thought because I got pulled out to help with another challenge, another classroom, or the kid was sick, or I had to reteach this lesson. All that's fine. But that's why we can't assume it's going to happen. And if you don't collect treatment integrity data, it's just like some dude talking about his high school dating life. Maybe it happened, but until you have the data, we're not going to believe it. So there's also a place if you wanted to, and you don't need to do this, but in this book, Managing Challenging Behaviors, there's an entire chapter, just one chapter that goes through this same thing. So already you're building in a professional learning plan for people like yourself that it can be varied. They can listen to this recording later. They can come tonight. They can read this book chapter. They could just click through the slides. There's a little tiny, like 30-second video that explains what it is. So lots of ways and lots of levels of depth. But the nice thing about this is that you are teaching a kid a skill that won't go away later. So just like Howard was saying, like at some point we will exit this intervention and the kid will stop, collecting data and seeing how it's going, but we're not going to stop self-monitoring. Like I'm just going to be doing that implicitly. And to find out for real, open up your chat if you would. And this is going to be a yes or no question. Do you make a list of things to do? Like, do you write things down, like a list of things to do? Yes. Okay. Next question, yes or no. After you've written your list, do you cross things off when they are done? Miriam, I love that you're laughing. Yep. Okay, next question, yes or no. How many of you have ever written down something that you've already done that they do and keep track of can influence it? Now, this is not going to work for acquisition deficits. And those are things that kids have not yet learned to do. So like if I was doing this, if I was going to self-monitor on pull-ups, like number of pull-ups, and that's all I did, I can tell you the answer is 0 today, like independent pull-ups. The answer was 0 8 years ago when I started CrossFit. It is still 0 today, right? I have made exactly 0 progress in being able to independently do that. I have not yet built the muscle mass that I need to do that. But there's other things that I have gotten better on. I'm listening to more books on tape. I'm actually keeping track of, and this is, you might laugh at this, but I love to write. I keep track of the words I write per day. My goal is 250 words per day, or it translates basically to 1,000. I know people are like, seriously, little Rain Man kind of thing. That's okay. But it translates to about 5,000 words per month. So I don't do it 7 days a week. I do it 5 days a week. It translates to 60,000 words per year. And the reason why that's important to me is I feel like I get to learn from amazing people, like some of you that are on this call, and I get to have these partnerships. So I want to write up what I'm learning to share with other people. This is also not a good strategy if kids are exhibiting self-injurious behavior where they're hurting themselves or aggressive behaviors. Those things we don't want to bring down slowly. We want to stop those things fast. So we want to keep those things in mind. And just like you saw Mark walk through those steps, here are the steps that you would use in self-monitoring. You have to make sure that kids have the prerequisite skills. So the thing that you want them to do, you need to make sure that it's in their repertoire, because otherwise no amount of M&Ms is going to make it happen because they haven't learned it yet. That requires a different intervention. So I want to make sure they can do what you're asking them to do, the assignment, the activity, the task of joining a group. And then we're going to define that. Now, if you have that paper open right now, you can see that what I just shared is right here at the top of designing this plan. Thinking about a kid, she needs to be able to answer these 3 questions. Is that behavior able to be something that is can be defined, it's observable, it's measured, and can the kid keep track of it? Yes or no? Are they capable of controlling that behavior? Can they do that behavior without your assistance? And then the next thing, is it happening frequently enough? So Jessica's got to be thinking about, okay, for the kid that I have in mind, if that behavior only happens 1 time every couple of weeks, this isn't the best intervention for that. So it has to occur with a high enough frequency. And then once we figure out the thing we want to see more of, we want to define it and give examples and more and non-examples of it. And we want to define the thing that we want to go away. Now, I would be taking notes as to this particular kid, and I want to think about what do I want that self-monitoring procedure to look like, including the actual form. Because in some schools, just like what Tammy was saying, like she came up with a common method of measurement for the younger kids and the older elementary kids, and then that was consistent. And what a gift, because then every adult in the building knew what to look for and how to keep track of that. And it's not enough just to hand the self-monitoring form to the kid and say, good luck. You need to teach them how to use it. And then you're going to have to decide like what's going to be the cueing system. If the kid happens to have an Apple Watch or has a phone, you might have an auditory signal. Eric and Wendy and I right now have an opportunity with this partner, and what they do is they have a YouTube video, and it plays in the background in the classroom. And there's like a gentle, it's not like a harsh ding, it's almost not quite a drip, but a similar sound to that. And it goes off every 10 minutes. And so there are actually 3 kids in that class that when that cue, they hear it, they look at their self-monitoring form and fills it out. So that got taught to the kid, it got taught to the teacher, and that's just taking place. And then when Mark was talking about making sure that the form has enough movement to show growth, like if something is yes or no, it's hard to show progression. So you're going to want to have something that is closer to that 0 to 11 point scale so that we can see how it's doing. And then we want to check in to see what it's looking like. You can also find in those documents this 1-pager. So this 1-page thing, so that like if Elise or Allison was going to be the go-to person in this school to say, like, these are the 2 co-coaches for the self-monitoring intervention, then it might be that Jenny looks at her data and realizes, oh, I've got 2 kids that might benefit from this. Then she can tap into either Allison or Elise and say, can you walk me through setting this up? And the reason for having 2 people co-coaching this is we want to make sure that we don't tie up all our resources in one person, because if that person moves, marries, anything like that, retires, you lose your capacity. So co-coaching is really nice. And just like I was talking through these steps with you and showing you where they go, you have all these resources. So it's matching to sample the stuff that you would read about and walk through. So if you were right now to think about a child that you think, okay, I want them to do this certain behavior, what behaviors come to your mind? And if you've already done self-monitoring interventions in the past, please feel free to throw them in the chat as well. But what's one behavior that you feel like, ooh, I would like to try this as a tier 2 support to either increase what or decrease what? The behavior that you're going to graph, the thing that you're going to have the kids self-monitor and maybe have the teacher check as well, I would strongly encourage it to be the more positive behavior. And the reason for that is think about how that's going to feel for a kid. I'm going to have a graph and I'm going to see this graph going up, like I am getting better at turning my work in or being engaged or asking to join a group with my friends versus I'm less mean or I'm less of a failure today. So it just from a positive behavior intervention and support stance, consider that. And then when we start to make these self-monitoring checklists, we want to make sure, as Tammy alluded to at the very beginning, we want it to be age appropriate. So your little kid form might look different than your bigger kid form. And we want it to be clear. And if you're in a school like that's doing Ci3T or something that has academic behavior and social emotional well-being, or if you're in any kind of integrated tiered system, the reinforcer for this should be the same reinforcer as the school-wide reinforcer. We don't want to introduce a competing system. So if like you have a ticket as an acknowledgement system, so your self-monitoring form for a slightly older kid might look like this. So like it might be you break down 5 tasks and then they can say, did I do it in accurate, and have maybe the accuracy with it, they did something. And then you're going to work with them to say, for completing everything, just for completion, not accuracy, you might earn 1 ticket. If you hit a certain benchmark of on average, you did 80% or better, you might get another one. If you're comparing your ratings to what the kids saw and they're accurate and they had a terrible day, you might also reinforce that because you're reinforcing honesty, that they filled out the form correctly. When Mark was talking earlier, there is some emotional charge thing about the frowny face versus the happy face. So you might choose to start that form to explain it. And then over time, maybe not do the frowny face, maybe just do a straight face. But the idea would be, and we have these on the website, and again, they're editable. Not edible, editable. So again, we'd want to take time, but oftentimes people will spend an inordinate amount of time on these. But once you've got this tier 2 resource built, that's what you're going to use and not tweak it. And part of what we're trying to do is protect teacher time. You have wonderful colleagues on this call tonight. We've got 20 people logged in right now. You do not need to take 20 people's time to design a form. We want to have one thing that is unified. And then after it's created, then you're going to want to explain it, go over the rationale. And if it were me, and it was the first time I was designing this in, like when I was building my Ci3T system, I would use the student members of my Ci3T leadership team to get input before finalizing the form. I would basically workshop it with the kids. So if you were going to bring this intervention in as a tier 2 grid, then she might take 5 or 6 kids, like maybe 2 7th graders, 2 6th graders, 2 8th graders, and say, this is something new that we're going to be starting. It's not for every kid, but when kids are having these type of challenges, we want to put this in place, and we'd like to get your input because we want to make sure they have a voice. And just like Howard was talking about, they don't have to stay in this intervention forever. And we want to make sure that kids know we're doing this because we want to help you to have an even better experience in school. So once that's built and you've taught it and you're going to use it, you're going to actually not just file these data, but we're going to look at them. So when Mark was talking about graphing, we want to do that. We want to give them feedback on the accuracy of how they fill it out. And we want to share this information with them. So like if they're doing this self-monitoring sheet, the 90-minute ELA block, so maybe we do it during the independent time for that. So maybe when it gets to the independent time, or maybe it's center time, and you say, this is what I'm going to have you use your self-monitoring to make sure you're doing these things well on your own. Then at the end of each of those periods, you might help the kid to graph it. And at the end of the week, you give them some feedback and a week, and a reinforcer at the end of the week. So we want to make sure that it's creating these positive interactions, and it is distinct or different from the check-in, check-out, in the sense that it's not following them to other settings or other periods. This is in one specific area. So the target you're going to set together. So the graphing is not something that is just done by and for the adults. It's actually a communication tool with the students. And so you're going to do something that is age appropriate and understanding, but basically it's not saying yes or no to each of these and doing yes or no. It's the percentage that's going to get graphed. And that's how you're going to get, like, if it was accuracy, you might have the accuracy of the assignments. In the perfect world, we'd love for you to collect baseline data before you start, like from your grade book, to see what did accuracy look like, put this intervention in place so that you can show the child how well they've done. And then eventually we do want to start fading, but we're not going to say don't self-monitor anymore because you don't need it. You want to make sure that they know this is something you can continue to do, but you do it as in a little less formal way. And just like with the DBR, you have all these resources at your fingertips so that if I was going to do this, like if Wendy was going to do this with me, she could keep track of this 5 days a week to see, did she do all the things that she was supposed to do? And did I do all the things I was supposed to do? So that if somebody says, well, maybe this didn't work because you didn't do it right, you actually are going to have data to say, actually, I kept track to make sure I was doing all the parts that I needed to do, so that we can accurately interpret how well it worked. Because treatment integrity data is not like Big Brother watching. It's legit so that did this plan get in place as planned? Whereas social validity is finding out from the beginning and end, are you comfortable with this? Now, I have to be honest with you. As I mentioned just a little while ago, if at the beginning the kid tells you, I would be really embarrassed to have this on my desk to keep track of it, then you might say, all right, well, what would you think about if we put it like on the inside cover of your notebook? Would that be better for you? And if they say, I just don't like this at all, then go to a different intervention. Then do something like a DBR or do something like check in, check out. But the student voice is important because, again, we want them to be part of that solution. And in your manual, if you have found self-monitoring, you're going to probably find an intervention grid. These are towards the end of your manual, and it might look like this for the elementary or this at the secondary school. And so what we just showed you, me and all my personalities, is exactly that slide deck, and everything that was an image you have access to. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to kind of build your capacity as well. So one of the things that we're going to ask you to do, rather than just, contemplate this, we're going to encourage you, if you would, to open up your own personal calendar right now. And I'm going to invite you to block out a 15-minute block of time where you're going to commit to yourself to go back to this tiered library approach and think about either these two or explore something else. So when you're looking here, like when it got brought up of like, oh, what about check in, check out? Great idea. That might be something you want to check out. You might want to check out an academic intervention at tier 2. Like a lot of people are unfamiliar with self-regulated strategies development for writing, SRSD for writing. Really great, simple, effective intervention that has enough evidence to suggest that if I do those strategies, it's going to empower kids to write higher quality, or it might be you just want to give yourself a little bit more time to invest in these 2 interventions that you heard about tonight. So when we think about where we are, you can do these interventions that we talked about tonight, even if you don't have a Ci3T model. We're not saying you have to have that in place to do these tier 2 interventions, but the benefit of having the system and having that clarity at the base is you've already done things like level the playing field by teaching expectation, giving everybody common languages, making sure that the expectations that are posted in classrooms, that every adult is familiar with them, and teaching those skills that promote well-being to minimize internalizing and externalizing behavior patterns. By having those clarity, then when we're doing these things at tier 2, everybody in your building will know what a tier 2 is. They're going to know exactly the data that are used to accurately connect kids to those supports. Because frankly, the thing I worry about more than anything is that not every kid, if we don't do school-wide screening, not every kid's going to have an adult in their life that can help them get the extra support that they need when they have it. And it's not fixed. Like there's different times where kids might need extra support. And just like the protractor story at the beginning, tier 2 doesn't have to be overly complicated. It can be pretty effective short-term things. And like Howard was mentioning, you want to have a plan. You want to have a goal to evaluate how well this is working and then make decisions about when to fade, when to intensify, and when to completely conclude. And some of the things, like if you're here tonight representing a secondary school, one of your tier 2 supports might be connecting a child with a mentor. If that starts to work to keep them, more engaged in school, less elopement, fewer office discipline referrals, you don't want to remove the mentor when that's working.